Hi, and welcome to today's devotional. Glad you're back with me as we are in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verses 4 through 8, where Paul is changing his focus to the topic of giving, specifically the need for the Corinthians to do their part in raising funds to help the saints in Jerusalem. So the first 5 verses in chapter 8, Paul is focusing on the example that the Macedonian churches had set through their giving. And like Pastor John spoke about yesterday, this giving came through an overflow of their joy. In verse 2, Paul's talking about the Macedonian churches, and he says, "For in a severe test of affliction, their abundance of joy and their extreme poverty have overflowed in a wealth of generosity on their part." Now, Paul's highlighting two main points here, and both of these points flow out of the character of the Macedonian churches. First, the Macedonians gave under difficult circumstances, and we're not told the exact nature of the test they were enduring, but we know it was severe and that it involved affliction. And second, the Macedonians gave joyfully and extravagantly, even though Paul said they were in extreme poverty. Now, I just have to say, as I was reading this, it's incredibly convicting. And it made me wonder how well the Western church grasped this concept. Do we primarily give out of our comfort, or do we give extensively even under severe circumstances? And I think this is exactly what Paul is doing for the Corinthians. He's challenging them, right, by providing an incredible testimony and standard of what genuine sacrifice and love looks like. It was a monetary overflow of a spiritual richness and joy the Macedonians possessed, in spite of the fact that they were extremely poor. So as we continue on in verse 6, we see that Titus had actually started a collection for the saints in Jerusalem, and Paul was encouraging him to complete this act of grace. And I have no doubt that Paul's previous description of the Macedonians was used to cause the Corinthians to reflect on their own motives and hearts and help them to complete the act of grace. And I think we can see this was Paul's intention when we look at verse 8. Paul says, "I say this not as a command, but to prove by the earnestness of others that your love also is genuine." Paul's making it very clear that he's not using the authority card here, meaning he's not looking to make the Corinthians think this is a command straight from God. As a matter of fact, Paul says later in 2 Corinthians chapter 9 that God loves a cheerful giver. And so he wants the Corinthians to give voluntarily, out of a heart that flows with joy. Again, Paul using the example of the Macedonian churches to fan the flame of the Corinthians. So in terms of looking at application, there are a number of ways we could go with this. But there were two specific things that came to my mind as I was preparing this devotional. The first was a question, and that question is for Bethel, our church. Are we giving in such a sacrificial way to the kingdom as a whole that Paul would have used our example to encourage other churches? And if you happen to be watching this and you're not part of Bethel, then the same question for your church. And the second thing that came to mind is, how do you give? And what I mean is, has giving become something that is so automatic that maybe you don't really think much about it anymore? You still give faithfully, but you write a check or maybe you give online and you move on without really thinking about it, without dwelling on the act of giving to the Lord. What you were just providing was part of your worship. So I want to encourage you, we can't forget that our giving is a wonderful and joyful part of our worship. I'll never forget attending a church service in Uganda where I was able to experience and watch how they gave. I remember watching people dance and sing as they came up in front to give what they had to the Lord. Sometimes it was money, sometimes it was a chicken, but it had nothing to do with others seeing how they gave, and had everything to do with joyful saints that were giving out of hearts of worship. So that's my question for you today. When you give and are being faithful, is it out of a routine, or is there an intentional joy that is present as you give your offering to the Lord? Hopefully that encourages and challenges you today. God bless you guys. Love you. And Lord willing, we'll see you next week.